return to one of our lead stories now. The Home Secretary, James Cleverly, he's rejected claims the government was wrong to say the backlog of older asylum claims has been cleared, despite new figures showing thousands of cases remain unresolved. So, joining us now to work this one out is former Labour MP Bill Rammell and Research Fellow at the Centre for Policy Studies, James Price.
Well, let's kick off with the numbers. There were almost 100,000 legacy cases, so these are the cases that date from before the change in the law. And the government says that the backlog has been cleared. But, Bill, 4,500 cases might have been processed, but they're still sitting on the books. What's going on?
Well, I mean, the claim from the government is dishonest and fraudulent. Legacy claims, these were claims that were not processed under the Tory government, and they're now claiming they're being processed. 5,000 and the 4,500 are complex cases that haven't been resolved. Really worryingly, 17,000 have been withdrawn. Disappeared. What's happened to those claimants? Where are they within the system? They're presumably still within the UK. And overall, we've got 98,000 further claims in the system, which means the figure of outstanding claims is 8 times higher than it was when Labour left office. It's a scandal.
Although I suppose, James, we've basically halved the total number. If there were around 100,000 last year, there are 90-odd thousand now. Robert Jenrick, the former Migration Minister, has been saying a lot about this, saying about the sort of systems he's put in place, the reward structure and incentive structure within the civil service. Does this mean that potentially the backlog might be completely cleared by the time of, say, a November election?
That's certainly the government's hope, isn't it? I think fraudulent might be pushing a little bit much. There's always the case where, these numbers kind of get massaged, and I think the PM's spokesman said, oh, well, I meant by June 22, and all these sorts of massaged numbers. I think we can debate some of the niceties there. I think the problem is, really, that there are so many asylum claims coming through now. There was this great big backlog, there's still big numbers in the system, all the rest of it. But if we look at what happened, say, 20 years ago, we just got a release of some of the documents about Tony Blair's attempts to try and get these numbers down as well. He was feeling very frustrated back then. And some of the nuclear options being considered then are still things we're having to look at now. You're seeing a lot fewer cases back then coming than we see today. And today there's a higher percentage of claims that are actually being accepted. We think these are all reasonable claims. It's a bigger question to look at. And I think we're struggling at the moment to integrate as many people as we've got. And can we actually get all these people and let them integrate into society properly? If we're not doing that, if people are going missing once they've had these claims accepted, that's not a moral thing to do, and I think that's the deeper issue. Yes,
because the government have said, oh, well, we're accepting fewer asylum claims. They say 67%, that's down on last year, it was 76% last year. But if you go back to 2018, only 33% were granted asylum or allowed to remain in the country. That's a very large leap over just a few years. And also, I think what a lot of our viewers and listeners want to know is, are those who have had their claims rejected being removed from the country?
And that's a really good point. Where these people end up going, often they end up sticking around as well. I think when your viewers and listeners think about what an asylum seeker is, right, in their heads, when they close their eyes, they think about really vulnerable people in some of the poorest, most war-torn parts of the world. Our hearts go out to those people. We want to do, as a rich country, what we can, do our bit to help. But I suspect so many of these cases of these people are not the people we imagine that we're actually helping. Lots of them are kind of, working-age men who have been coming over from France in small boats, then claiming asylum. Lots of charities that are out there saying, if you say this and you say that, you're more likely to get this happening, and they throw their papers away. I think there's a really deep scandal in there, which is why you mentioned Rob Jenrick. It's why he resigned, I think, because he realised the scale of this problem.
But, Bill, is there something that perhaps we can learn from how Tony Blair went about this stuff? Far fewer people proportionally being accepted back then. What was going on? Because it seems to me that perhaps the legal system has evolved. Perhaps lawyers act more as activists today than they did 20 years ago, and perhaps the interpretation of rulings from the ECHR and all the rest of it have made this much harder to deal with.
I don't think that's the case. I mean, I was a minister at the time, and I acknowledge that before 2003, we hadn't properly got a handle on the system. There was then intense government focus led by the Prime Minister, and you say there wasn't judicial activism at that stage. I remember David Blunkett reporting to a Cabinet subcommittee that the judges have threatened that they will take us on. So these challenges existed, but we worked at it, we were serious and we were rigorous, and we brought the numbers down significantly. And forgive me, that is what is utterly lacking from the present government. You know, it's gimmicks, headlines, and no serious
A lot of people will say that
case?
Tony Blair, opened the door to mass migration. Of course, a lot of people still to this day say that Tony Blair made a mistake when it came to that.
Well, but that's different from asylum seekers.
Of course, it's different. Of course, it's different.
European workers who came here to work and contribute.
Well, it was a mixture of people from all over the world, of course. But talking about the judiciary and talking about the law on this, we've seen a number of cases recently, including today, an Albanian crime boss jailed for money laundering, his gang's profits, and so on and so forth. Again, judges ruling in his favour to stay in this country.
Yeah, and we do, rightly or wrongly, I think rightly, have a separation of powers between government, the executive and the judiciary. And that presents a challenge. We faced that challenge in government. The current government does. But we worked at it. We were serious, cross-departmental initiatives. I was at the Foreign Office at the time. I used to meet with my Home Office counterpart every week with respective officials going through the cases, really probing, getting the numbers down. You need that serious application, which is currently lacking.
Is it, to some extent, a big international problem that we're seeing? The United States are seeing not tens of thousands, but millions of people crossing their southern border. In continental Europe, you're seeing the number of people crossing borders seeking asylum up by 80%. In the UK, it has come down to some extent, and the government's new line this morning, which is perhaps more of an effective comms line than constantly talking about Rwanda. But in the UK, asylum seeking is down by a third. In Europe, it's up by a huge degree.
Yeah, but I mean, part of that is what I think is a temporary reduction in the small boats crossings. And, the border agency is saying that as the weather improves, there's going to be a real surge in numbers. If you look at the figures overall, and I made the point earlier, the unprocessed asylum claims are 8 times higher than they were in 2010 when Labour left office. And what really puzzles me is why the government keeps scratching at this. Constant announcements that fall apart under scrutiny. There's been a massive briefing campaign this morning. So the Home Office officials are briefing that the government has fiddled the figures, and officials in Conservative Central Office are briefing that the Home Office has failed. It's chaos.
And this is a really interesting bit, that maybe you had judicial activism 20 years ago, completely agree with that, still a problem now. It'd be interesting to see the number of civil servants working in the Home Office now as there was 20 years ago. The size of the central estate has absolutely blossomed. It's got much, much bigger. And you can see all these stories coming out of the Home Office in particular, who are saying, what we're doing is cruel, it's mean, it's nasty, I don't want to work on that. And so you're starting to see that the enemy inside the Home Office are these civil servants who don't want to work on these kind of things, think it's mean and nasty not to let people into the country and all the rest of it.
I don't think that's the case, but I do agree. It was John Reid, when he was Home Secretary, that said the Home Office is not fit for purpose. And I think under successive governments, that has been the case.
You don't think there's any element at all of civil servants who may cause obstacles to government policy?
My experience,
Not at all.
My experience in government was that if you gave a firm lead, if you were on top of the detail, you got the civil service to work with you. In the Home Office, I think there are cultural issues, and it's not about ideological opposition. It's just about... I'll give you an example. I was Higher Education Minister, and I was arguing for 2-year post-study visa regime. And I had a meeting with Liam Byrne, who at that stage was the Immigration Minister. And he and I were agreeing on the way forward. And the official from the Home Office was flatly contradicting us. And I'm going, hold on a minute, we're the elected ministers. You're the official. It's cultural, it's not ideological.
And I suppose one of the big things is that the longer you've been in power, if you're Margaret Thatcher and you've been sitting there on year 11, you sort of know how to sort of work your way through the system. Whereas if you've had, how many education secretaries have we had in the last 5 years? How many home secretaries?
Housing ministers.
You don't build up that institution, that knowledge in terms of how to work around things, which is probably something that will also hit Keir Starmer if he's going to win the next election. How many people in his government will have ever been in government before? Probably not that many, really.
More than in 1997 when we came to power.
That's true. That's also true.
Right.